So wrapping up our topic on revolutions in the Americas and then also continue on with the idea of the Enlightenment, we're going to wrap up talking about particularly the Latin American Revolution. So previously we looked at the ideas of the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, nationalism, and then we kind of talked about the revolution in Haiti. So now we're going to target predominantly in Latin America and then the effects and the long-term changes that went on in Latin America, as well as continuities that existed, kind of from the, again, mid 1750s through the early 1900s. All right, so here's our Haitian Revolution notes that we did in the last video. So to kind of review here, here's our mestizo social class, predominantly in majority of the Spanish colonies, not Portuguese Brazil. Okay, so we have our peninsulares who are on top. Those are the Spaniards born in Spain, who predominantly are the ones running local authorities, the various local and regional governments within the Spanish colonies. Then you have the Creoles, who are kind of that second ring of people. Okay, typically those who are born in the new Spanish colonies, but they have Spanish parents and ancestry. Then you have the mestizos, who are both of Spanish and indigenous parentage, and also you get little other groups of classes of Spanish-born and African-born as well. And then you have, your native indigenous peoples, and then enslaved peoples from the Africas or from Africa and the Caribbean. So mind you, this all varies again based on what land you're in. And the enslaved persons, okay. Typically, this is much, much higher in Brazil and in the Caribbean than it is on the actual Spanish colonies of like Mexico, or what we know to be like Mexico, Argentina, Venezuela, Colombia, El Salvador. Those don't have as many numbers of actually enslaved persons. Okay, Brazil, very much the opposite. Same thing with most of the Caribbean colonies. So again, belonging predominantly to the French and to the British. So just quick thoughts to think about. Which group do you think would gain the most from revolution? Who would have the most to lose, and then which group would have the best access to Enlightenment ideals and be wanting to promote change? So who would actually have that education? Who would actually want to go ahead and promote change and try and get some benefits out of there? So that's some kind of stuff to keep in mind here. All right, kind of the entirety of the social classes. So within the independence movements, so it's predominantly ending up being led by the Creoles. Probably not a surprise in the sense that these are the people born in New Spain with Spanish parents. And so they are kind of, again, that second tier. And while they're educated, they're enlightened in that sense. They typically have better access to business, to wealth. But they're not the ones in control because, again, that's the peninsulares. So they're the ones who kind of push for it. And oftentimes also aided by the mestizos and also in some cases the indigenous and some of the enslaved people. And sometimes they also fight back and forth over, who's going to lead the revolutions, and then also, as we'll see, long afterward. So you can kind of see down here the map of showing the dates of the independence movements themselves. All right, so, we have the American Revolution that happens in 1775, 1776 when it begins. And then you have the French Revolution in the late 1700s, starting, the 1780s and 1790s. And then you also see Haiti here, 1804. But between 1821 and even before then, with Paraguay and Chile and Uruguay and Argentina, you get these various independent movements. So that by 1838, within the span of about 25-ish years, all of South America, with some notable exceptions of the Guianas, which are British and I believe British and Dutch or British and French colonies. All of Spanish North America, with the exception of Cuba and Puerto Rico, are essentially, or the Spanish territories are essentially free. And so this is due in part again to the French Revolution. Why is that? Well, the French Revolution throws off a lot of the dynasties and the monarchies that exist in Europe at this time, including Spain and Portugal, which Napoleon did occupy, and he put his relatives on the throne of both of those kingdoms. So within Spain, that kind of weakens their authority, their ability to fight the French, but also hold on to said colonies, leading to independence movements starting within, Paraguay and Uruguay, and then also Mexico and other locations throughout South America. Within Portugal, the royal family ended up fleeing to Brazil and essentially saying, yeah, we're ruling in exile, but we're ruling in one of our colonies. And then once, Napoleon is gone, the Portuguese move back to reclaim their throne, and they leave essentially, an heir to the throne in Brazil, and he becomes sort of like the Brazilian, the Brazilian emperor, Brazilian king. Once Brazil declares independence, it's a constitutional monarchy that compares the two. But that doesn't really last very long. And then, Spain tries to hold on to their, territories, their colonies, but again, due to warfare, conflict, lack of money, they really are not in control anymore, and so they have to actually end up giving that up. And so that's where this, comes into play. But yeah, and so, and again, depending on what area you're looking at, you see different groups. There are different movements for various levels of independence. So like here we have Mr. Simon Bolivar, who Bolivia is named after, who wanted to create what he wanted. What was it, like Gran Colombia or Gran America? Essentially, try and create like one massive, large country that would include like Venezuela, Colombia, Brazil, Bolivia. Not a successful thing, and at one point, you have here the United Provinces of Central America, where El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua are. They would eventually break up in independence in the 1830s. So yeah, and so many of the upper class Creoles are fighting for their own version of nationalism, their own. We are separate from the Spanish rulers or the Portuguese rulers, and that's what we are fighting for: is to unite our peoples. Even though, as we will see throughout, they do not give equality to a lot of the mestizos. They don't give it to a lot of the indigenous peoples or the enslaved peoples for a very, very long time, and we'll examine that as we go. And then there's our notes there on Portugal, right? Portuguese Brazil. Okay, so in terms of politics in independent Latin America, what does that look like for the governments that kind of exist at this point? Well, a lot of them try to follow enlightened ideals, but however, in comparison to the United States, which had, again, practice, it had time with independence, with some local sovereignty and things of that nature. The political structure of Spain and what was the Spanish colonies and Portuguese Brazil, they did not have any sort of like direct or even local control. Most of it was controlled, but again, by the Peninsulares, who were acting on orders of the European monarchs. So local government was not something that they had a whole lot of say or control in. Okay, and I wish that looks smaller, but oh well. So the politics and the governments, okay, most of the countries are led or end up being led by the elite Creoles. They do not want to give any power back to the Peninsulares. And people known as caudillos. I believe I'm saying that right. If I'm not, I do apologize. So caudillo or caudillo would be this guy right here, okay, General Lopez de Santa Anna, the guy who ruled Mexico, I think, on 8 different occasions in between like the 1830s to like the 1870s, I think. Yeah, I could be wrong on the time frame. So they are the ones who are in charge of the politics of the government, and so they're also fighting between like, do we go with more liberal ideas? Do we go with more conservative ideas? Do we try and follow a moderate path? And that depends again on who is in charge within these given locations. But at the same time, when you have the local elite Creoles running the government, you also have, they are the ones who are the wealthy ones running the businesses, running the ranching, the plantations, the mines. And so they're in charge of much of the economy. So there's a very strong tie between business identity and the government. But again, we're still dealing with a lot of lack of representation for the majority of the populations. Definitely no political representation for women at this time. There's a lot of high government turnover and instability. The book mentions a lot of conflicts, particularly looking at Mexico. So governments are going in and out. Leaderships are going in and out, like I said. Santa Anna over here, like I said, I think it was like 7 or 8 times he was the leader of Mexico at different times. It wasn't like he got elected time and time again. It was like, no, he took over several different times. A lot of instability and revolutions. There's wars between countries. Part of that instability comes along with also the United States invading Mexico during the Mexican-American War. You have Spain trying to put itself back down into its former colonies at one point. And then, those who rebel are often violently repressed by those governments. And so against the underrepresented and the property-less poor is in there, okay? Then we also got this guy, Emperor Maximilian, who was essentially a French elite person. I believe he was like the son or like the son-in-law of like Napoleon III, who took over France for a little bit in the 1860s and 70s. And installed this guy here, Maximilian, to essentially be the next ruler of Mexico. That didn't go well. So when we think about the holiday of Cinco de Mayo in Mexico, okay, that is a Mexican independence day. It's Mexico's independence from a French monarch put on their throne or in charge of their government. And then you also have issues about, the role and the power of the Catholic Church. Do we allow the Catholic Church to have lands? Do we allow them to go untaxed? How much say do they get in government? Do we try and include them in education? Things of that nature. So you have these conflicts that are going in, and for the most part, again, this leads to a lot of instability within the various countries. So you're not seeing any really long-lasting republics or constitutional monarchies or constitutional democracies that last for any one given time throughout much of Latin America. Now, I can't obviously go case-by-case basis here, but, again, Mexico definitely fits under that category for sure, as well as a number of others. So, yeah. Then fighting, as we said, between liberal, conservative, moderate voices. So, yeah, most males cannot vote or participate in government. So, again, if you're a mestizo or a indigenous person for a long time, you're not given those rights. And then the indigenous peoples are often excluded. They're kept on the fringes of society or forced to assimilate into essentially, European, Creole or even mestizo mixed race culture. Their lands are often confiscated for the expansion of ranching and agriculture because that's where the money is in many cases. For a lot of South American, or so much of the South American economy is based on exporting of goods, which we'll look at in the next video. And so, yeah, they are taking away the lands from them, which leads to more revolts, more, controversy, more conflict within these countries. So, yeah, very, very messy in this sense, and in many cases, it takes a very long time for them to establish stable governments that represent the people fully, as we will kind of expand on in the next video when we talk about economics. We'll play it back into the idea of government and politics here, and also look at the social classes in our final video from chapters 28 and 30.